The wind had died sometime in the small hours, and that is the first thing you have to understand about what they found, that there was no wind at all on the shelf that morning, and yet something was moving the air. Picture the light. Antarctic light in the last week of a traverse, in a season when the sun does not set but merely leans, dragging shadows out to absurd lengths across a plain so flat and so white that distance stops meaning anything. 2 Ferguson tractors and a sledge train, tracked wheels frozen into the surface overnight, the metal so cold it took skin. A thermometer lashed to the sledge rail reading -49, -50 by 9 o'clock, and 200 meters east of the camp, out where the previous evening's survey line had ended in a cairn of empty fuel drums, a black hole in the ice, not a crevasse. This matters, and the men who stood over it understood immediately that it mattered, because every man on the ice learns to read crevasses the way a sailor reads water. A crevasse is a wound, jagged, tensioned, walled in that fractured blue that means the ice has been pulled apart under strain, with the snow bridge sagging over it and the edges undercut and treacherous. This was not that. This was round. Not perfectly round, not machined, but round the way a throat is round, an ovoid aperture roughly 2.5 meters across its long axis, and the ice at its lip did not break away in plates. It curved down into the shaft in one continuous glazed surface, smooth as the inside of a bottle, and the rim was rounded over like the edge of something that had been worn rather than cut. And it was breathing. I want to be careful with that word, because it is the word the men themselves reached for, and once you use it, the argument is over before it begins. So let me describe only what the mechanism looked like. A column of vapour stood above the hole, perhaps 4 meters high, dense white at the base and fraying to nothing at its top, and it did not stand steady. It swelled and thinned, it swelled and thinned. Roughly 7 or 8 seconds of rising, of the column thickening and lifting until it leaned over the edge like a slow wave, then a pause, then a diminishment, the vapour drawing back down towards the aperture until it was little more than a haze skimming the ice, and then the swell again, slowly, regularly, in a rhythm you could count to, and every man who stood there counted to it, and the interval did not change. At -50, vapour is the visible confession of warmth. Air at that temperature holds essentially no moisture. It is a desert. Anything that fogs at all is doing so because something with heat and water in it has met something without. Which is to say, the shaft was not merely warmer than the surface, it was warm enough to hold water as a gas and expel it in quantity continuously for as long as they watched, and they watched for the better part of a full working day. Then there is the smell, and here is where I have to slow down, because in 14 years of reading through polar field records, and I have read a great many of them, the tedious ones, the frostbite inventories, the endless columns of sastrugi orientation and depth, Hoare measurement, I have never encountered anything phrased quite the way this was phrased. The surviving radio traffic and the field notebook agree on it. The vapour had an odour, not the flat mineral nothing of ice, not fuel, though a sledge train reeks of paraffin and every polar man's nose is calibrated to it. The word in the notebook is meaty, warm and meaty, faintly sweet, like the air over a stockpot, and this is the phrase that stopped me cold and has not let go of me since, like a byre in winter, like the inside of a cattle shed, the exhalation of large animals in an enclosed space. You have to sit with the implication of that for a moment. 1,600 kilometres from the nearest seal, 500 metres of floating ice beneath your boots, and the ground is breathing out barn air. They argued. This is the part of the record I trust most, because it is the least dramatic and the most human. The radio log kept at the base station, the one the operator wrote up in pencil in a school exercise book because the proper forms had run out, records the 3 of them arguing about sound, because there was a sound coming up the shaft, and the argument, transcribed in the operator's shorthand, is not an argument about monsters. It is an argument between three exhausted professional men about acoustics. The senior of them held that it was wind, that the shaft ran down and along and opened somewhere else, kilometres away, and that a pressure differential was driving air through it, and the aperture was simply whistling, the way a bottle whistles. It is a good argument. It is the argument I would have made. The youngest insisted the sound had the wrong shape for wind because wind does not stop. Wind gusts and lulls, but it does not hold a beat. And whatever was in the shaft held a beat, and the beat matched the vapour. And if you stood at the rim, you could feel warm air move over your face, and then feel it stop, and then feel it move again. That is the 18th day of the traverse. The 18th day of a routine glaciological survey line, 3 men and 2 tractors and a sledge of drill cores running east across a shelf section that the chart showed as continuous, uninterrupted, 580 metres thick, and dead. They radioed it in as an anomaly. Ice feature, unmapped, thermal. The base logged it. There is nothing in that first transmission that suggests any of them were frightened, and I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy and cheap for me to imply otherwise. They sounded interested. They sounded like men who had found something worth a paper. What is in the log, in the operator's pencil, is the last thing the senior man said before they went off the air to eat and to make a plan for the following morning. He said the walls were wrong. Not warm, wrong. He said, no drill makes a bore like that, and meltwater does not glaze ice. Meltwater pits it and channels it and leaves it rough, and this was polished, and it was polished all the way down as far as a torch beam would carry, which was not far enough. And then he asked the base to confirm that nobody had drilled here before. The base confirmed it. Nobody had drilled there before. There was no drilling program within 90 kilometres of that coordinate, no abandoned bore, no cached equipment, no earlier traverse that had come that way. The shelf section had been overflown twice and crossed on the surface once in 1957 by a party that had run a line 40 kilometres to the north and reported nothing. The chart was blank because there had been nothing to put on it. They went down the following morning, and this is where the record thins for the first time, and it never fully thickens again. The descent was rigged conventionally. A tripod over the aperture, an alpine winch, 9mm line, 2 men down and 1 on the surface tending the rope and the radio. That is standard practice, and it is what the field procedure of the period required, and it is what they did, and then at some point in the first hour they stopped doing it, because the third man went down too, and the record does not say why, and the record does not say who made that decision. And there is no version of the story in which leaving the surface unattended in Antarctica at -50 is a reasonable thing for a trained man to do. The first 11 metres were vertical and smooth. Below that, the shaft canted, perhaps 15 degrees off plumb, and widened, and here is the first detail I cannot make ordinary, no matter how I turn it. The widening was regular. Not the ragged flare of a thermally eroded conduit, not the hourglass of a moulin, but a steady taper, wider at every metre than the metre above it, as though the shaft were the neck of something and they were descending into the body of it. At 22 metres, the temperature was above freezing. At 31 metres, one of them recorded on a field slate that was later transcribed into the Traverse notebook in a hand that is not his, +9 degrees Celsius. +9. In the interior of a shelf whose mean annual temperature at that depth should have been -22 and whose thermal inertia should have made local warming physically absurd. 580 metres of ice does not hold a warm room in it. Ice conducts. Ice equalizes. A cavity at +9 inside that mass should have closed itself by melting its own ceiling and refreezing it over and over until it was gone. It should have been a memory of a cavity. It was not. They stripped. This is in the notebook, and it is one of the few things all 3 of them apparently agreed on afterwards, in the fragments where they can be said to have said anything at all. They took off their outer windproofs and their overmitts, and they left them hanging on the rope, and I want you to sit with the image of 3 men's parkas hanging in a shaft in the Antarctic ice like coats in a hallway, because that is what the winch operator at the base later said the photograph of the recovered gear looked like, and there is no photograph of the recovered gear in any archive I have found. At approximately 40 meters by the rope marks, the shaft opened. The chamber is described in the Travis notebook in 11 lines. 11. The same notebook devotes 2 full pages to the density of a fern core taken on the 9th day. 11 lines, and I have read them more times than I can defend, and they say this: the space was large, larger than the torches could resolve, with a floor that was level and yielding underfoot. The air was still and moved in pulses, and the walls were not ice. That is the phrase. The walls were not ice. Then, in the same hand, a correction that is worse than the statement. The walls were ice, but the ice was outside. The ice had formed around. Around what? The notebook does not say. It says the surface behind the glaze was ribbed. It says the ribbing was regular and continued past the limit of the light in both directions, curving. It says one of them put a bare palm against it, and the ice at that point was thin enough to see through and warm enough to be uncomfortable, and that when he took his hand away, the print stayed for longer than a print should. And then the 11 lines stop, mid-sentence, and the next entry in the notebook is a fuel calculation dated 4 days later. What we know after that comes from the base. 2 men were hauled up, not climbed, hauled on the winch in a recovery sequence that the base log records as taking 51 minutes for 11 vertical meters of assisted lift, which is the pace of men who are not helping. Neither of them spoke on the way up, and neither of them spoke at the rim. The station diesel mechanic, who was one of the 4 men who had come out from base by tractor when the Travis party missed a radio schedule, said in an interview recorded in 1988 that he had put a mug of tea into the senior man's hands, and the senior man had held it and looked at him and not drunk it, and that he had stood there holding it until it went cold, and that he had not been shivering, and that this was the part the mechanic mentioned twice. The 3rd man climbed out, unaided. He came up the rope, hand over hand, in his inner layers with his parka over his shoulder, and he came over the rim, and he was humming. That word appears in 2 independent places. In the mechanic's interview 37 years later, and in a single line of a base medical daybook where the physician noted, on admission, patient vocalizing, nonverbal, continuous, not distressed, vocalizing. And when the physician asked him what the tune was, he stopped and he seemed to think about it, and he said he did not know, and he did not do it again in front of anyone who wrote anything down. They were flown out inside a week. And from the moment they came up out of that hole to the moment they were separated at Christchurch, no one could get the 3 of them into different rooms. That is not an inference. It is in the station's accommodation notes because it caused a logistical problem. 2 of the 3 were assigned to the medical bunk room, and the 3rd to his own berth, and the 3rd did not go to his own berth. And when the matter was pressed, the senior man told the station leader that they would be staying together, and the station leader, who had been at Scott Base for 2 summers and was not a man given to indulging his people, wrote that he did not think it wise to insist. They slept in shifts. Someone was awake. There is a line in the daybook, and I have looked at the microfilm of it, and the ink is unremarkable, and the hand is bored, that reads, "They will not all sleep at once." Have not established why. None of them spoke about the chamber again. Not in the debrief, which exists and is 2 pages and says almost nothing. Not in the geological report, which describes an unmapped thermal feature and gives its dimensions and does not mention that anybody entered it. Not to the mechanic who asked. Not, so far as any surviving relative I have been able to reach can tell me, to their wives. Except once in a hospital in Christchurch in the 3rd week, when the youngest of them, the one who had said wind does not hold a beat, the one who had climbed out on his own, the one who had been humming, was being settled for the night by a nurse whose name is recorded and who told the story exactly once to a local paper in 1974 and never again. He asked her whether warm air could remember a person. She said she told him no. She said she asked him what he meant, because that is what you do with a patient who says something like that in the dark. And she said he thought about it for a long while, and then he said that it had gone all the way through him, in and out, for a long time, and that it had been very warm, and that he had not minded it. And then he asked her to leave the window open. She left the window open. It was March in Christchurch, and the night was mild, and there was no reason not to, and she wrote nothing down, because nurses do not write down which windows they open. The detail survives only because she remembered it 14 years later, when a reporter came asking about the Americans and the New Zealanders who had come off the ice that summer, and she gave him 400 words, and the paper ran them on page 11 under a headline about frostbite. So let me show you what else survives. Because this is the part where I have to stop telling you a story and start showing you paper, and I want you to understand that the paper is thin, and that its thinness is the whole point. There is a photograph. It was taken from the roof of the generator shed at the staging camp, looking south-southeast across the shelf, and it is a bad photograph, overexposed, tilted, the horizon running uphill, and it exists because somebody was testing a camera before the traverse went out. The time is written on the back in pencil. It is roughly 6 hours before the 3 men reached the aperture. And in the middle distance, at what any reasonable reading of the bearing puts within a kilometre of where they stopped, there is a smear, a pale vertical smudge against a pale sky, the kind of thing you would call a scratch on the negative, except that it does not have the hard edge of a scratch. It rises, it leans, it behaves the way a column of vapour behaves in a light wind. I have gone to the survey chart for that quadrant, the one compiled the previous season, and at that position the chart says shelf, solid shelf, not thin ice, not a crevasse field, not a melt zone, not an area flagged for caution, solid shelf, cross-hatched, uninteresting. So either the chart was wrong, which happens, or something was already breathing there before anyone found it, and no one on that roof, holding that camera, looked at what was in the frame. Then there is the physician's note. Christchurch, and before that the sick bay at the base, and the sequence is continuous enough that you can follow it. 3 men, all 3, core temperature elevated. Not dramatically, not a fever anyone would call alarming in isolation. The numbers hover a degree and a half above where they should sit. It lasts 11 days. All 3 of them in step, decaying at roughly the same rate, in 3 different beds, on 2 different sides of an ocean. The physician tests for infection and finds none. He notes it. He notes that he cannot account for it. He notes, in a phrase I have read more times than is healthy, that the elevation appears to be resolving rather than responding. Resolving rather than responding, as though it were finishing something on its own schedule. And there is a supply manifest. This is the one that keeps me up. The traverse was resupplied by air in the first week of the following month, and the manifest for that flight exists, and on it, in the column for drilling and coring equipment, there is a list, and the list has a line drawn through it. Not a cancellation stamp, not an amendment initialed and dated. A pen drawn through, by hand, and nothing written in the margin to say why. The equipment did not go. No one ever drilled the aperture. No one ever cored the wall the men said was not ice. There is no requisition anywhere that I can find in any of the following seasons for a return to that position. You will want that to be a conspiracy. I understand the pull. But I have spent long enough in these records to tell you what it actually looks like from the inside, and it looks like a man with a pen and a flight weight limit, and a note on his desk saying the thermal feature is not a priority this season. It looks like nothing. Erasure in this world is almost never a hand over a mouth. It is a translation not commissioned, a specimen that was never received, a witness quietly reclassified in the margin of a psychiatric assessment as imaginative. And then, in the winter of 1963, the shelf did the thing that shelves do. The section carved. A front some kilometres wide came away, as those fronts had been coming away for 10,000 years before anybody wrote anything down about it, and it turned in the current, and it went north into open water, and it melted. The coordinates that the three men reported, the latitude and longitude that sit in the traverse log in a bored hand, the numbers I have typed into more mapping software than I care to admit, now describe a patch of the Southern Ocean. 2,000 metres of water. Nothing beneath it but sediment and dark. There is no sight. There is no wall to core. There is no aperture to lower a camera into. Whatever the ice had formed around, if the ice had formed around anything, went into the sea in pieces and became water, and the water became weather, and the weather has been falling on all of us ever since. So let me now argue against myself, as honestly as I know how, because you deserve the strongest version of the ordinary answer, and I am not going to give you a straw one. The Antarctic has geothermal features. This is not fringe, this is textbook. There is volcanism beneath that continent. There are subglacial lakes held liquid by heat from below. There are places where the rock is warm and the ice above it is thin. A vent breaching a shelf, exhaling warm, saturated air into -50, would produce exactly the visible column those men saw and exactly the glazed walls, because vapour condensing and refreezing on ice glazes it smooth in a way no drill ever will. The organic smell, the meat smell, is what warm air does when it has passed over microbial mats and mineral sulphur and standing water in the dark. The rhythmic pulsing is barometric. Caves breathe. Every caver knows it. Pressure changes outside. The cave inhales and exhales, and in the right geometry it does so with a period slow enough and regular enough to sound, to a tired man on a rope, like something asleep. And the men, 3 men, exhausted, 18 days into a traverse, descending into an unventilated space fed by volcanic gas, which means carbon dioxide and possibly hydrogen sulfide, which means hypoxia, which means euphoria and confusion and a warmth that is not real and a conviction of presence that is one of the best documented symptoms in the whole literature of confined space rescue. 2 of them come out unable to speak because they are hypoxic. The third comes out humming because he is hypoxic and euphoric. They will not sleep apart afterwards because they went through something terrifying together and because folie à trois, shared psychosis in an isolated group, is not exotic. It is a known outcome of small parties under extreme stress. The elevated temperatures are gas exposure and stress response and the imprecision of a mercury thermometer in a cold, sick bay. I find this persuasive. I want you to hear that clearly. It accounts for the vapour, the smell, the pulse, the glaze, the silence, the sleeping in shifts, the question in the dark. It accounts for nearly all of it. Here is what it does not account for, and it is small, and I cannot make it larger than it is. The wall. 2 of the 3, independently, in the 2 documents where either of them describes the chamber at all, say the same thing in different words, that under the glaze it was not ice. That it did not sound like ice when struck, and did not look like ice where the lamp caught it edge on. Hypoxia distorts what you feel. I am less confident that it makes 2 men, separately, reach for the same wrong noun. And the window. Because the youngest of them lived another 41 years. He went home, and he worked, and he married, and by every account of every person who knew him, he was ordinary and quiet and well. And he slept, in Wellington, through 4 decades of winters, with the window open. His wife told a relative it was a habit from the ice. She said he never explained it, and she never asked twice. If the hole was merely warm, if it was rock and gas and bad air and the honest confusion of exhausted men, then he came out of it frightened, and frightened men close windows. So go back with me. The camera holds on it, a black aperture in the shelf ice, no wider than a manhole, exhaling a slow, visible column into air at 50 below, and the column leans and gathers and thins and leans again, in and out, with the patience of something that has been doing this for a very long time and expects to continue. Three men on the surface, arguing about whether that sound is wind. Two of them will come up in silence. One will come up humming, and he will spend the rest of his life letting the cold air in every night for 41 years, as though he were keeping something ventilated, or as though something were being let out, or as though, and this is the version I cannot put down, he was leaving it away back in.